The analytical papers that you are assigned to write in HT502 may be very different from other papers that you've written before, so I want to give you some guidance, some advice on how to write them and how to write them well. So in the syllabus, there are two documents that pertain to these kinds of assignments. First, the document that talks about my expectations for your analytical papers. And I say there that these papers are a kind of academic family tradition. So for example, the late David C. Steinmetz, my external advisor for my dissertation, Richard A. Muller, my doctoral supervisor, or Fuller's own John L. Thompson. We use this kind of paper to focus you on the sources. The purpose of these papers is really derived from a Renaissance and Reformation principle. They represent a return to the sources. Erasmus was a humanist, a Renaissance scholar who was a contemporary with Luther, and Erasmus produced the first printed Greek New Testament, a New Testament used by all the major reformers. And Erasmus was part of a movement that said, don't take people's word for it. Don't believe everything you read. For example, in the scripture, go back to the original Greek, study it for yourself. And the reformers agreed with this principle. So in this course, the purpose is for you to acquire a familiarity with primary sources. So Pelagius's letter to Demetrius is a primary source. So is Augustine's treatise on the Spirit and the Letter. Those are primary sources. But the introduction to that is not a primary source. And so when you quote the introduction, you're not quoting Augustine. You're quoting someone's opinion about Augustine and what Augustine means. And in these papers, I'm not really interested about what that scholar has to say about Augustine. What I am interested in is whether you understand Augustine and the argument between him and Pelagius. So primary sources are the theologian's own writings. Secondary sources are when somebody writes a book or an article about the theologian. A tertiary or third level source are like textbooks, and they are of even lesser authority when writing about a thinker. Okay? So you wouldn't use them in a research paper, and you definitely don't want to use them in these papers. Now, these papers also teach you how to be discerning and to read for yourself and to come to your own conclusions rather than just repeating what some scholar says. And believe me, scholars can be wrong. And in your Old Testament and New Testament courses, I'm sure that you have to write exegetical papers. And I say in my expectations document, that this is a historical exegetical paper. The text is the primary source, whatever primary source you happen to be reading, not the commentary, not the introduction. You want to ask, what does the text have to say? What does the author say? And why does the author say it? Why does the author say it in this particular way? What's motivating the author? What are the problems that the author is facing? And I want to say, don't be offended by this, but these papers are not about you. Okay? Your personal opinions, your theological perspectives, they matter, but not here. They don't matter in these papers. I don't want you to prove that Pelagius is a heretic and that you don't like him. It's already been done. Okay? I don't need you to defend Augustine. He does a fine job himself. What I care about is whether you understand Pelagius accurately, whether you understand Augustine, whether you understand what motivates them and the nature of their arguments. And this goes to the matter of using a method of sympathetic understanding, which I emphasize at the beginning of the course. Why would Pelagius think the way that he does? Now, don't worry, I'm not going to report you to the church police if you think that Pelagius makes some good points. Most heretics are actually quite brilliant, and simply dismissing them as fools is intellectually lazy and frankly not that honest. So you want to describe a thinker's views in such a way that they or one of their followers would recognize themselves in that description. They would read it and say, yes, that's right. Don't create a caricature of the writer's views or spin it in a negative or even positive way. And your essay should be written in a style that is appropriate to graduate school work, master's level work. You are working on a master's degree of some sort, and your writing should reflect that. Your writing should be clear, it should be well organized, and it should be written in a manner pleasing to the reader. If it's painful to read, it's painful to grade, and when you receive the grade, it will probably be painful. So, very important in ministry, I think, is the ability to communicate effectively, to communicate persuasively, to communicate well, clearly. Grammar and spelling errors should be even less evident here than in college level papers. Preferably, they should be non existent. And you might look at that and say, oh, look, is that cute that's spelled wrong? No, it's not cute. It makes the person who wrote it look dumb, uneducated. Okay, so don't do that. It'll hinder you in ministry if you write that way. Having a third person, a third party proofread your paper is highly recommended, or read it out loud to yourself or to your cat. Maybe your cat likes that kind of thing. In academic writing, it's a formal kind of writing, so you want to avoid contractions. Use did not instead of didn't. Use is not instead of isn't. Remember that its, its, is the possessive form of it. And remember, if you want to say it is, actually write it is. Don't write its, which, by the way, is spelled like this, IT apostrophe S. Choose your words wisely. If you confuse, for example, then and than, if that was my cat. If you write, for example, Pelagius emphasized free will more than Augustine, you project a lack of education. Whether it's true or not, that's what you project. It sounds like you are posting on Facebook at 3 a.m. It just does not sound good. Just a few other things to remember in that regard. If you use the term begs the question and you don't really know what that means, don't use the term begs the question. Most people use that phrase incorrectly. Begs the question means it assumes the answer in the question. Okay? That's not what most people mean. You can say this raises the question or brings up the issue of. Don't say begs the question. That's incorrect. Don't write in regards to. It's in regard to or regarding. Use that. Use complete sentences. Do not use sentence fragments. Do not use run-on sentences. Do not make comma splices in sentences. Another thing, use technology to your advantage. Technology in some ways has hurt people's ability to write, but it also provides aids to writing well. Use your word processor's spelling and grammar check, for example. When you're unsure about a point of grammar, check the Grammarly.com website. There's a Grammarly add-in that you can get for the Google Chrome browser, and I think even an add-in for Windows itself that can help you with spelling, grammar, composition kinds of issues. And most of all, use and abuse the Fuller Writing Center. That's what they're there for. They want you to use them. It makes them feel important. It makes them feel needed and wanted. So make sure you take advantage of that resource that is there for you. Secondly, let's look at the first prospectus. One way to really bomb on this assignment is to ignore the directions. By coincidence, a way to do really well is to carefully follow the instructions. So the assignments are not as complicated as some people think. I think people can get tripped up by making the assignment more complicated than it really is. These papers are not research papers. And I think students run into trouble when they use a method that is more appropriate to a research paper. In fact, you do not need a bibliography. You do not need a works cited paper. You do not even really need footnotes at all. You can write in parentheses, for example, P, page 50 for Pelagius, letter to Demetrius, page 50. Next, follow the instructions in the prospectus very carefully and the questions that are asked. So for Augustine and Pelagius, there are three questions. How does Pelagius characterize salvation and the Christian life? You want to be really careful that you answer that question in your paper. What roles are played by Christ, grace, nature, or free will? You want to answer those questions. The second question, it's the same question except that Augustine is the subject. So what you can do, you're free to arrange this how you want. You could say Pelagius says this about salvation, the Christian life, Christ, grace, nature, or free will. Or you can go by the different topics and say, on Christ, Pelagius says this and Augustine says that. On grace, Pelagius says this, Augustine says that. Then look at the third question. How might Augustine counter the assertions of Pelagius? And then vice versa. In other words, if they were having an argument, what do you think they would say to each other? What would they find objectionable about each other's arguments? What would they worry about? What would be their legitimate concerns about the other person's theology? Okay. And then take hints from the body of the prospectus. So, for example, when I write, Pelagius took offense at these words in Augustine's Confessions 10:31. Give me strength, O Lord, that I may do all things. Give me the grace to do as you command, and command me to do what you will. Why would Pelagius be offended by this? Pause. That's a very important question for you to answer in your paper. Make sure you answer it. You should compare the views of these two 5th century Western theologians in terms of their view of human nature and their estimation of human abilities. What do they think about human ability to sin or not sin? The nature of the human free will, how it is affected or not by the fall into sin. There's lots of hints on how to do this paper well. A lot of it simply hinges on following the directions carefully. And then you will do well if you follow those directions carefully. Okay? So take those directions seriously, follow the directions, write carefully, thoughtfully, clearly, without fluff and pious verbiage talking about how wonderful Augustine is and how terrible Pelagius is. That may be true, and it's irrelevant for this paper. I want to know if you understand Pelagius and Augustine, and the same later with Luther, and the same later with Calvin. And that's how to write these papers well, and also to learn a lot about Christian theology directly from the sources.